say I got it. Okay, good. So as a way of introduction, let me remind you that some of the most exciting development in quantum materials over the last 25, 30 years or even more involves sort of two key concepts in quantum physics of materials. One has to do with how electrons interact with one another when there is strong Coulomb repulsion between electrons. These are effects that give us things like Mott insulators, which behave also as very interesting magnetic systems, being liquid systems. And then as we dope these materials, they give us high temperature superconductivity, which is still a phenomenon after 30 years or so. We're trying to still understand what goes on in very complex oxides in which such correlation effects give us superconductivity at very high temperatures. Now, on the side of the topology of the electronic wave function, there's been tremendous amount of discoveries starting back from the quantum Hall effect in the 1980s, fractional quantum Hall effect, which is also not only topological, but it's a correlated state of matter. And more recently, the discovery of topological insulators and interest in topological superconductors. So the topic that I'm going to talk about today, the Moiré material, what makes it really interesting is it takes these two major themes of condensed matter physics, which has been going on for quite a long time, and brings it together in a single material platform. And as I will describe today to you, the discovery of these materials and the discovery of interesting physics within these materials, superconductivity and other phenomena within them, really makes a very model situation in which for us to understand sort of electronic correlation topology in very clean material system. In material systems which are not, for example, doped or very complex in terms of the chemical structure, but can be extremely simple, like just two layers of graphene stacked on top of one another. Conceptually, what I will also try to tell you about today is that some of the physics that we see in these materials can be really directly sort of similar to things we have seen in correlated materials. For example, materials in which you have d electrons, which has very strong interaction because electrons occupy the same orbital, where there's a large Coulomb repulsion between the electrons, and very weak hopping or comparable hopping between the electrons between these d orbitals. And this is kind of the physics of correlated materials. And we see that in these systems, some of this physics can manifest itself on much larger, somewhat larger energy scale, like a tens of nanometers, which brings the energy scale of U and T smaller compared to what we are used to in these very complex materials. But it makes it rather manageable experimentally to explore this physics of strong correlation, again, in clean material system. Now, in connection to topological system, I'll just remind you that, the way we come about topology from the 1980s was the way in which we apply a magnetic field to a 2D electron gas. And in a 2D electron gas in a large magnetic field, you create Landau levels in the presence of a magnetic field. And this occupation of this Landau level, the large degeneracy of these Landau levels is what gives us all the physics of, integer and fractional quantum Hall physics. And as you'll see here, the concept of having very highly degenerate states, which are flat in sort of momentum, but very sharply defined in energy, flat bands, is one that is actually what got this field of Moiré material started. So let me just, and also as you'll see here today, the novel thing about this material system is this interplay between interaction and hopping of electrons, which can be such that the interactions are very strong. And as you'll see, this leaves a very interesting imprint in how the behavior of the system is in many of the respects that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with what has been discovered, but let me just start from the very beginning. And remind you about what people started to think about 10, 11 years ago. What will happen if you take two layers of graphene and put them on top of one another? So if you just imagine that you twist these two layers of graphene relative to one another, you have, of course, when they're aligned, you have the graphene lattice is perfectly aligned. But as soon as you start to rotate them relative to one another, you have this beating of the two atomic lattices of the two graphene layer, which gives rise to this Moiré superlattice You get a moire pattern every time you have two periodic patterns interfering one another. And what you see is basically with your eye is that there is an additional length scale in the problem, which is larger than the atomic length scale, which we'll talk about what it is in this material in a moment. It depends on the angle, which is subjecting electrons to moving through the graphene lattice to a larger periodicity in the lattice. So about 10 years ago or so, people started thinking about what will happen to the graphene electronic structure if you subject the electrons to this additional periodicity, which comes from the Moiré superlattice. So now let's go back to the graphene band structure. I remind you that graphene has this linearly dispersing band structure, the Dirac spectrum that you're familiar with. And I remind you that basically the graphene crystal structure gives you this hexagonal lattice, not just in real space, but also in the momentum space where you have these 6 Dirac points. And now what we have is we have 2 layers of graphene stuck on top of one another, and we start to rotate them relative to one another. And you can also think in momentum space that the Dirac points are now rotated relative to one another, and ask the question, what will happen if you have 2 layers of graphene now twisted relative to one another, where you have this displacement between the 2 graphene Dirac points, and you start to you have the electrons talk to one another between the 2 graphene layers. So when you have interlayer interaction between the electrons, basically wherever you have overlapping of the band structure between the 2 graphene, basically Dirac cones, you start to modify the electronic structure. And what you see here in the intersection between these 2 these 2 Dirac cones is a sort of a crossing which starts to get modified by the presence of the interlayer interaction. And now, depending on how strong is that interlayer interaction compared to the Fermi velocity and also the dispersion having to do with the dispersion of the lattice of the electronic structure of the graphene, you can start to modify this point. This point that is a saddle point, it starts to move down as you start to crank up the interaction between these 2 layers. And what was recognized in these early paper, in particular by Bitzitler and McDonald, was that as you start to go to very small twist angles between the 2 graphene layers, and if the interaction strength between the 2 graphene layers is strong enough, what will happen is this point, this graphene structure where the 2 bands are coming out of the 2 Dirac points will start to flatten out because of the interlayer hopping between the 2 graphene layers. Now, in a now seminal paper from 2011, Alan McDonald and Bitzitler basically showed that there is a magic angle at which when you twist the 2 layers of graphene relative to one another, this flattening of the band because of the interaction between the 2 graphene layers can become perfect. So as you see in the middle of this panel, first of all, I note that there are a lot of bands here on either side. And remember that this is an extremely complicated material. It's very chemically simple in the sense that it's just 2 layers of graphene. But if you ask what the unit cell is of this material, because it's quasi-periodic, it will have a unit cell that can involve maybe 10,000 atoms. So it's very difficult actually to do a sort of a very realistic calculation of the electronic structure of this material because of the large number of the atoms within the unit cell. But within this continuum model, which involves some assumption, McDonald and Bitzitler showed that at a very specific angle, you get this very flattening of the bands, which is the blue lines here in the middle of the figure. So what's special about this? Well, and actually I encourage students and others who always get into a field to always go back to the original paper and actually read through the end, because it always tells you, kind of where the discoveries come from. And if you go back to Alan's paper and read the very last paragraph of his paper, he remarks that, well, if you have these flat bands, which has large degeneracy, and if you start to partially fill the electrons within these flat bands, you're going to force electrons to strongly interact with one another. And just right there in this paper, basically, they sort of speculate that because of the interaction with electrons, you can have a lot of exotic effects. You can have magnetism, other types of order state, maybe superfluidity. So this became kind of some idea that was in the air, and people went on to investigate it. Of course, the big discovery came from Pablo Jarrillo-Herrera's group at MIT in 2018, which Pablo really spent a lot of time to figure out how to precisely align these two layers relative to one another. His graduate student, Yuan Cao, really figured out how to, I'm going to describe to you how you make these samples in a moment, really figured out how to get this really precise. And the precision needs to be within 0.1 degree. The magic angle is about 1 degree, but you got to get it to within 0.1 degree, otherwise the phenomena doesn't appear. So let me strip the problem down for you. So we have these two flat bands that are very close to the Fermi energy. We got to call them a conduction and valence flat band. Those are these two lines in the figure on the left here. And let me just tell you that we have 2 spin degrees of freedom and 2 Valley degrees of freedom. So you can you can think about this in the Brillouin zone of the Moiré Brillouin zone of this material. You can fit up to 8 electrons into these 2 spin and 2 Valley states, basically when you fill up the 2 bands. And what you see on the right here is a density tuning, which was done, as I'll show you, in gated devices in Pablo's experiment, where as you tune the density of the electrons in this system, where you bring the chemical potential within these flat bands that are very close to the chemical potential, you can observe an insulating state, which is a correlated insulator, and in a metallic and as high temperature and superconducting state very close to the insulator. So the reason this got a lot of attention is because if you take this phase diagram of having superconductivity appear near a correlated insulator is correlated because you're partially filling the band, which you expect it to be a metal, but that partial filling the system because of interactions becomes an insulator. And then as you tune away from this insulator, you get a superconducting state. And the resemblance of this sort of behavior to that of many correlated superconductors, including high temperature cuprate superconductors, iron superconductors, even heavy fermion superconductors, some of them between sort of a magnetic state and a superconducting state, it got a lot of attention. And this has become kind of one of the key problems, is try to figure out what is the nature of interaction between the electrons in this material. How do you get the insulating state? What is the nature of this insulating state? And what is the nature of the superconducting state? And the hope here is that because of the chemical simplicity of this material, we can shed some light on the nature of superconductivity in presence of very strong interacting electron system. And we will move away from material systems which are chemically very complicated, like cuprates and iron pernicotite, but come into a system which is chemically very simple. Okay, so that's kind of a way of my introduction. So let me tell you what the plan is for my talk. I'm going to tell you how we use this STM, which you guys are all expert on to explore the properties of magic angle graphene. And I'm going to show you how the signature of strong interaction shows up in STM spectroscopy. And I'm going to show you some really surprising things that we've been able to do with the STM, is actually using the STM to actually detect topological phases with, quantized Hall numbers, and also spend some time talking about the nature of superconductivity in this material, and then looking ahead to what we are working on right now. So before I go any further, let me tell you who's done all the work. This is a team effort. The top 4 names here, Kevin, Monchel, Dylan, and Ryan, have been a team that has been working on this problem for quite some time. Actually, we wouldn't have really gotten very far on working on this problem unless Xiaoming Liu, who is the name on the bottom, joined our group from Philip Kim's group, who really gave us the sort of know-how on how to make these samples, and other students who are working on graphene system, Galara and Cheng Li, figuring out a lot of details about how you make very clean 2D devices, which I'm going to tell you about. And as I go along, I also tell you about our interaction with our local theorists, Andrei Bernovic and Bill Lang, who's been really critical for us to understand the experimental results that we've been getting at. Okay, so you're all very familiar with STM, so I won't belabor the point about being able to do atomic imaging and doing atomic resolution spectroscopy and being at millikelvin temperatures. This is basically spectroscopy limited by the temperature of cooling your electrons, and having the ability to do spectroscopic mapping with the STM. But really what got me excited about this field, and there are other STM folks who have done this before we got into it, but what really got me excited into getting into this field was the fact that here we have a material system in which it shows a lot of different physics in terms of its behavior, superconducting, insulating, and other behavior, even in presence of a field, as you'll see, that can be tuned with a gate voltage inside. So this is really a crystalline device that we are making. And I think this is kind of a novel thing about all these 2D materials. You're taking monolayers that are crystalline in structure, which makes STM experiments like the ones we all work on meaningful because you can get really atomic resolution information and get very, results that you can try to interpret. And having the ability to tune in situ the gate voltage and density of the sample, of course, is critical to observe all these phases that you're talking about. But from those of us who've been working on sort of correlated system, where we had to tune through many different samples to study a phenomena, for example, as a function of doping, this is an enormously powerful knob to be able to in situ tune the properties of your sample. So let me just spend a minute. Some of you may be familiar with how these devices are made in this field. Basically, the way this is made is use some plastic, which is some sort of polymer, which you go and you start to pick up different layers of material because the plastic is sticky and it sticks to these monolayers of boron nitride or monolayers of graphene, which you use Scotch tape still to this day to make monolayers, putting on silicon substrate. Now, the big trick that came from making of these devices is that sort of the tear and stack technique, which is that you can partially try to pick up a piece of graphene, and by partially means that as you try to pick up part of it, you actually tear the piece of graphene apart, and then you can come back and stack what you have teared on top of what was not teared before in order to make these twisted bilayer devices. Now, as you all know, working on STM, plastics and STM don't work very well together. Leaves a lot of residues on your sample, which makes it extremely challenging to do very clean experiments. And this is what something we've spent an enormous amount of time developing all kinds of recipes. And we're still, trying to figure out the best recipe on removing the plastics in order to get really clean samples. And when you manage that, and it can happen, and it depends on a lot of details, which I won't go into, you start to get devices where you can start to see the graphene sublattice and not have a situation where you have plastic on the sample that will make your tip go unstable and make the experiment stop very quickly.
Ali, can I interrupt you for a second there?
Of course.
What is a little bit surprising to me in these stacking experiments always is that the claim is that you can make the angle the same over a macroscopic area, like, I don't know how big, like several microns or even bigger, right? That seems kind of strange to me, that the angle would be so precise everywhere and wouldn't just buckle and do some weird stuff, right?
In fact, the angle is not the same. So what our transport colleagues do is they try to make their samples below 1 micron or about 1 micron. And that's kind of, if you make a really good sample, in our case, you can see that the angle is sort of uniform within about a micron. If you go beyond that, the angle actually varies that can vary quite a bit. From an STM perspective, that's actually very useful, because in the same device, you can go around and study the behavior as a function of the angle, the twist angle changing. But you're absolutely correct. If you make the sample any bigger than about a micron, the twist angle is not uniform at all. And in fact, there is results from our experiments and also from experiments in Elie Zeldoff at Weizmann, which has actually mapped these fluctuation of the angle throughout the sample. But for us, that's not a bug, that's actually a feature. The fact that the angle varies a little bit, we usually try to make our samples about 10 micron in size or a little bit bigger. And the reason that is it makes it very easy to find using, capacitive and other techniques. But it has the advantage that the angle actually varies, and you can find early on, this was an added feature because we wanted to see always what's the phenomenon we're studying, whether you were at magic angle or not. Now it's a bug because we are trying to make, really perfect magic angle samples, and that's very difficult. Great question.
Thank you.
So now if you look at this image, you see a lot of different things. If you look at the finest scale, you see the graphene sublattice, the atomic lattice. If you look a little bit on the intermediate scale, not quite the larger scale where there are all the bright spots, but the intermediate state, you see actually another periodicity. That has to do with the periodicity that these materials are, we stack them on top of boron nitride, and there is always an angle between the boron nitride and the graphene underneath. And it turns out that's actually quite important, whether the boron nitride is aligned or misaligned with the graphene magic angle, which is about 1 degree. So it's a very small misalignment between the two layers. That's actually quite important. So here you can see that the boron nitride is not aligned because it makes its own Moiré lattice scale. And then you have this bright spot in this image, and that's a Moiré lattice having to do with the 1 degree shift between the two graphene lattice. And I'll tell you in a moment where the bright spots come from. But just measuring that periodicity of that Moiré wavelength, as it was actually done before by Eva Andre and Mike Cromie's group, where they looked at actually bilayer graphene in STM studies long time ago. You can actually read off the Moiré wavelength, the angle from the Moiré wavelength in these images. Structurally, what you're looking at is in the bright spots, you have good stacking between the two graphene lattice on top of one another. We call it AA stacking. And then you go between the bridge sites, and then you go between BA and AB stacking, which is where the dark spots are in this image. And I'll tell you in a moment where the bright and dark, why is it bright and dark in a moment. So now if you put your STM tip in the middle of this bright spot and do spectroscopy, of course, that depends on what the gate voltage is. But let me put the gate voltage to a large positive number, which actually pushes the two flat bands below the chemical potential. And what you see is two very sharp peaks. So what these two sharp peaks are the Van Hoos singularities of the two flat bands that I told you about, that comes from being at the magic angle. From this, you can read the bandwidth of the bands, roughly about 12 or 15 millivolts. Now, if I went away from the magic angle, these peaks will become very broad, and that's to be expected. And that was studied before by and Wong and Cromie and others. But what I want to impress upon you is that you get these very sharp peaks when these bands are fully occupied, and you get the same sharp peaks when they are fully emptied above the chemical potential, which is kind of what you would expect to see if you just looked at the band structure calculation from, for example, McDonald's model. And these are the Van Hoos singularities of the flat bands. And if you ask from the McDonald model, where should these enhanced flat bands be, it will tell you it's over the AA sites. Over the AA sites is where you have alignment between the two graphene lattice from the top and bottom layer. You have very strong tunneling between the two layers there. And that's where you have the largest density of states coming from the flat bands. So this is to be expected, and this was actually done prior to our work. But all the interesting physics happens when you start to partially occupy these bands, where you make the insulator and superconductor and so on. So first, I'm going to start at very high temperatures, and I'm going to show you data like this one. You'll see in my talk here today. Sorry, my cursor doesn't work for some strange reason. So I'm going to have to just describe what I see, what you're looking at. So on the left of the panel here, you see a color graph, where the color represents the tunneling density of states, with red being high. And the y-axis is the gate voltage, which is the density of the electrons. 0 is at charge neutrality. You see 1, 2, 3, 4 on the left-hand side of that, -1, -2, -3, -4. I told you there are 8 electrons that go into these flat bands per Moiré unit cell. So when the two flat bands are well below the chemical potential, you see the two peaks that I showed you in the last slide, which also appears here in the panel, the second panel. And it corresponds basically to two bright lines that you see below the chemical potential that are being kind of brought towards the Fermi energy as you sweep the gate voltage. So these are the two flat bands are fully occupied. They're very sharp. They look like two very sharp lines, two very sharp peaks. But as soon as you start to partially occupy these flat bands, what we discovered is that all those spectral features that were very, very sharp becomes extremely broad. Okay. And let me jump ahead where you go to -4, where you take the flat bands and you push them above the chemical potential. So they become completely empty. Then again, you recover which is the panel on the far right-hand side. You see again, two very sharp peaks. So our first discovery in this field was that when you partially occupy the band, the spectral property of this material goes from being very sharply well-defined Van Host singularities to extremely broad spectral weight. And this is something that in hindsight we understood, but at the beginning, which no experiment like this was ever done before in such a strongly correlated system, where you tune the system from being non-interacting, which is when the bands are completely full or completely empty, where you have these sharp peaks, well-defined quasi-particle, single particle physics explains the property of the SIMP system, to what you have in the middle. And what you have here in the middle is a rather complex many-body problem, in which you have these flat bands. The flat bands are partially filled, and the electrons are very strongly interacting one another, and they give rise to this very broad feature in the spectra. But if you look rather carefully at this spectra, you see that the spectra, even though it's broad, is not featureless. It has these features that kind of come and go as you tune the density in the material. So if you look at the panel on the left-hand side, you see that there's sort of repeated features in the spectra between 4, 3, 2, and 1. There are these sort of tail feather-like features that go out and they repeat as you change the filling. So to bring that out, I'm going to take the DI/dV measurement and divide it by I/V. And the reason that brings everything out is because when you go through the filling of the system, the density of state of the system is changing quite dramatically. And in order to take out the very large variation in the current, you have to take DI/dV and divide it by I/V. And when you do that, you kind of start to see that there is this sort of cascade of features in the data, which corresponds to integer filling of the system. So when it's 4, 3, 2, 1, when it's 4, it's like the two bands are completely filled. They appear two red lines below the chemical potential. But when you go between 4 and 3, 3 is the point where you have 3 electrons per unit cell in the Moiré, and then 2, 1, 0, and then -1, 2, 3. These features keep repeating themselves. So the first question is, where does this come from? Okay, and this is something that can be seen not at at very low temperature, even at 6 or 7 Kelvin, before this system becomes a superconductor or an insulator, before it shows any exotic behavior. You see the effect of very strong electronic correlation on this data, both in terms of broadening, but also in terms of these sort of repetitive features. What's also interesting is you can focus, these measurements that I showed you are focused with the tip on the AA sites, but you can put the tip on the AB site. And the importance of that is that there you become sensitive to bands that are not close to the chemical potential. We call them remote bands, or the bands that are not so flat, but you can still do spectroscopy on them with the STM. And what we notice is that if you measure the edge of these bands, which appear in spectroscopy here, you can see here at around 50 or so, you see a conduction band edge that actually shows oscillatory behavior as you change the gate voltage. So when we look at this, we start to realize that what's happening is that the system is actually changing its chemical potential behavior every time you go through integer filling of its bands. And this finding, the cascade of these transitions, which is seen in looking at just the spectra of the flat band or looking at the bands nearby, you can see that the bands are kind of moving back and forth, This was actually, if you plot the edge of that band, it behaves in a way that when people did experiments using a scanning SCT, from Weizmann Institute, where they measure the chemical potential directly. Here we measure it indirectly through the edge of this band. We find that the two data sets look exactly the same. So what we are finding is that the system sort of resets itself every time it goes through integer filling of electron in these flat bands, which is kind of important, because at some of these integer filling, when you cool this sample down, is when the material becomes insulated. And understanding how the electrons interact with one another, what gives rise to these sort of cascade of transitions, and what gives rise to these changes in the chemical potential as you go through this filling, is very important to understand what the nature of those states are. So a lot of people have worked on this problem. There are lots of different models in trying to understand what gives rise to this cascade of features. I have my own simple model, which I think works very well without any complications of imposing a lot of complicated physics. Because if you look at what's happening in the system, when you look at the STM image, it gives you already a clue. When you look at the STM image, it looks like a bunch of bright spots. What does that tell you? It tells you that that's where the electrons like to live. So what does that mean? It looks like just a lattice of quantum dots. This is what this system is. So this Moiré periodicity gives you this sort of lattice of sites in which the electrons like to live in these sort of little bubbles, which are about, they're like 13 nanometers apart. They're about 10 nanometer inside, or 5 nanometer inside. And you can ask your question, what are we doing? Well, this is where the flat band electrons mostly like to live. And you can think of each of these dots, and you can say, oh, I can put up to 8 electrons into each of these dots. What will happen if I compute the STM spectra, if I try to add electron to a quantum dot? Well, of course, the problem is more complicated, because it's just not a quantum dot with like an on-site interaction between the electrons. But of course, there's hopping of electrons between these bright spots. But since that problem is unsolvable, the hopping between many quantum dots, I'm just going to ignore it. And if you ignore that and just think about the quantum dot and ask what would be the electron addition removal spectra with a quantum dot, but add to that quantum dot the fact that you're dealing with two flat bands, which you can think of it as two levels, and you're dealing with two spin degrees of freedom, spin up and spin down degree of freedom, and two valley degrees of freedom. And you can compute what should the electron addition removal spectra look like. And I can go through explaining to you why this diagram looks the way it does, but it really is just like a charging diagram. It's a charging diagram of a quantum dot, which is a bit more complicated because a quantum dot has flavors of spin and valley. It's not just a single quantum dot with no spin or just a single spin. It's more complicated, and there are two levels in it. And you compute all the sort of addition and removal spectra. It's not a complicated calculation, but what's interesting is that it doesn't explain the data perfectly, but when you look at it and you look at the data, you start to say, oh, this really looks like the data. Even though the data has some other features, like the sharp features you have in this very simple model is not reproduced in the real data. So what's useful about this exercise is that if you look at the data, you see that there's features that go up to some energy and they keep resetting themselves. Like for example, on the positive side, above the zero filling. And what's useful about this exercise is from this comparison, you can say qualitatively speaking, if this was a quantum dot model, we can sort of talk about the strength of the Coulomb repulsion between the electrons, reading off basically where the reset happens. And it's about 30 or so milli electron volts, so 25 milli electron volts. And this number is very reasonable, having two electrons living inside one of those bright regions and repelling one another. And if you include the dielectric constant of the boron nitride nearby and your gate, what the distance is to your gate in our devices. So what's important about this is that this number is larger than the bandwidth of the electrons in this flat band. So what that means is that when you partially fill these flat bands, the interaction between the electrons is larger than the bandwidth. So there can be a lot of reshuffling of the electronic spectral weight and the property of the system. It makes this a very highly interacting electronic system where the bandwidth is smaller than the interaction between the electrons. And it makes it very susceptible to do kind of magnetism type behavior, because you can lower your energy by basically putting electron in one flavor of spin or valley or some combination of spin or valley to create sort of like a magnetic type problem, a Stoner type magnetism, whether it's spin polarized or valley polarized or spin or valley polarized. And that physics really comes from the fact that the interaction between the electrons is larger than the bandwidth of these flat bands. This was speculated, of course, but this is where you get it experimentally directly. Now, this is a bit of detail. People are now beginning to understand, there are actually theoretical calculations that are making connection to our data, saying that actually the way to understand the flat bands to begin with is to actually decompose the electronic picture into two pieces: electrons that are localized on these AA sites like I've been telling you about, and electrons that are hop between these sites. Kind of like what happens in heavy fermions, where you have F electrons that are very localized near individual, heavy elements, but then you have conduction electrons talking between these F electrons. So this is actually coming out of theoretical calculation motivated by our experiments and others. Okay, so what I wanted to tell you up to now is that if you do spectroscopy, we see these bands. The bands are sharp when they're full or empty. When they're unfilled, they get very broad. And when they're broad, they see these features when you partially fill them. And they start to tell you about the fact that electrons are interacting with one another. Now I'm going to show you actually these interactions actually has a consequence to create some interesting topological phases, which are both correlated and topological. So let me give you a little bit of, so this is actually kind of rare to find systems. So, integer quantum Hall effect, of course, is a topological phase, but this doesn't come from interactions. Fractional quantum Hall phase is correlated and topological, but it requires very high magnetic field to localize electrons to make them interact with one another. Here, you're sort of using this Moiré lattice and the interference to force electrons to interact in these flat bands because of what you've made, even with the absence of very large fields. So before I show you how we came upon studying topological phases with the STM in this material, let me tell you what was done before. There were two discoveries done before by David Gorhaber-Gordon and Andrea Young at Stanford and UCSB, where they discovered that if they make magic angle graphene and they align it with the boron nitride underneath, they discovered that you see signature magnetism. The magnetism manifests itself in the field dependence of the electrical transport properties. But as samples got better, in particular what Andrea Young did, he showed that there was intrinsic quantized anomalous Hall effect in this system, which you can train with the magnetic field, which is what's shown in the figure in the middle here. They discovered that if you fill 3 electrons up from charge neutrality, that's a very prominent state where they discovered that the system exhibits a quantized Hall effect that at zero magnetic field. Okay, so this is something that was discovered in magnetically doped topological insulator, but here without any magnetic doping, it's not a topological insulator you didn't think, and this was discovered. And the way people understood this is that graphene has this Barry curvature associated with its Dirac cone, and when you align it with boron nitride, you basically gap the Dirac points because you break the sublattice symmetry between the A and B sublattice, and get that the Dirac point is no longer protected when you break this A-B sublattice. When you align it boron nitride, which is boron and nitride, which is different than graphene in the 2 sublattice. And when you create this situation, you expose basically the fact that this system actually has a finite Barry curvature associated with the bands. And this was actually something that was anticipated theoretically. If it's driven by interaction, but it's very important to get this single particle effect having to do with the boron nitride breaking the symmetry of the lattice. So of course, we were interested in doing such experiments on devices that were aligned, but we were mostly examining devices that were not aligned. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with STM? In STM, we don't really measure Hall effect. right? We do spectroscopy. So how could we possibly tell that we have a Chern insulator with a topological like insulator system? So this is something that I learned through this process, which is if you actually think about what this means for spectroscopy, if you make these states, they are gapped states. So they are gapped, meaning that the bulk of the system has a gap. You have the edge modes that are flying around the edge of the topological phase. And these edge modes gives you this quantized Hall conductance, which has a Chern number, which is the C number that we have up here. Now, if you ask what will happen if I tune the density of the system, so remember, to measure the Hall effect, we have to apply a magnetic field. But if you ask what will happen if I tune the density of the system, I'm in a gap, but if I tune the density of the system, I could, I will shift basically where that gap is. And I have to actually shift the value of the magnetic field to end up in that gap. And this is related to combining the sort of this, the relationship for the Hall effect, combining Maxwell's law, Ohm's law, and the continuity equation. And you arrive at something that's very familiar with folks in the quantum Hall community, which is that if you vary the density and if you vary the magnetic field, if you stay inside that gap phase, this will happen along a contour in the magnetic field and density, which the slope of which gives you actually the Chern number of the system divided by the fundamental constants. So what does this mean practically for us? So practically, we made these samples and we were studying them at zero magnetic field. And then we started applying magnetic field. I'm going to come back. This is data taken at low temperature. I'm going to come back to what happens at low temperature in zero field, but I want to first show you what happens in magnetic field. As you apply magnetic field, you have some features, and then this is a similar kind of data. But what I want you to focus on is what happens near zero. What happens near zero, you get a lot of these sort of diamond-shaped features. And what these diamond-shaped features are the system develops a lot of gaps at a lot of different densities. Okay, and where these gaps are don't seem to correlate with where these integer numbers are. These gaps can be a different value of the charge density. So the charge density, remember, appears on the vertical axis that's controlled by the gate voltage. And when I say gaps, you really see some spectral rate. What's plotted here is actually, if you look down in there, which is hidden by the color plot, as you look down in there, there's actually some states that suddenly move across the chemical potential. And it's showing you that the system goes through a gap phase as you, for example, change the density or the magnetic field. So what's really remarkable is that if you take this kind of data and just follow in terms of where the gaps are as a function of the density on the y-axis, on the x-axis, which is related to the filling factor, and the magnetic field, which we can translate into flux per unit cell, because we can divide how much flux you put into the Moiré unit cell. This is a very busy plot, but what you have here is you have a lot of features that are very close to zero here. And that has to do with the fact that this system has a zeroth Landau level, which I don't want to get into the complication of that. It has actually degeneracy of the zeroth Landau level, which we are actually studying in this plot. But what's really interesting is that you see these sort of fans going out from 1, 2, and 3, and -1, -2, -3. You get these symbols. These are from many different measurements. And what you get is these gaps. That's the location of those symbols. These gaps basically follow a line which is derived from this formula, which is some number divided by the flux constant. So what's interesting about this is that experimentally, what you find is you apply a field, you study the system, and you get a gap. And what we find is these gaps often form around the chemical potential. So remember, the dark blue here is the gap is somewhere between -1 and -2 filling. Now, if you vary the field, this gap just moves in the field in the field density plot in order to reveal a number, a Chern number associated with what that phase is. So that's
Ali, can you please go back one slide?
Yeah. This one?
This plot reminds me very much of just Zeeman splitting, right? Am I missing something? I mean, isn't this just
Yeah. So what you're looking at here is so there is a gap here, okay? So you see this gap between -2 and 1, okay? So when this gap forms is when this flat band is near the chemical potential. You get the gap at some value. And it's at some value of density, okay? But now if so this is between -1 and 2. So it's like this one of these on the left-hand side. So there's a gap. But now if I change the field, this gap shifts in gate voltage to another value. It's always fixed at the chemical potential. Now, it's related to the flat band being in the chemical potential because it's not Zeeman splitting because its value is much bigger than Zeeman splitting. Okay, so the fields can be very, very small, and you just tune the density to bring the flat band to the chemical potential, and at some density you observe a gap. The gap can be like 10 millivolts. Okay, and the field can be very small. These fields are none of them are larger than about 9 Tesla, and you can observe them down to very low fields. For example, some of these you can observe down like +2. You can observe to like 0.1 Tesla. Okay, so what this is a gap that as you change the magnetic field, you have to change the electron density to keep the system gapped. And the relationship between what the density is and what the field is one that has to follow. Basically, what we discovered is that it follows this formula. Okay. And it turns out that, when you make, you can do different types of measurements, like you can do transport measurements where you observe a gap, and you can do the same experiment, or you can do compressibility experiment, which is what Jacobi and Feldman did, which observe a gap, and you get exactly the same plot. And those plots are made from compressibility measurements, which are sort of looking at a thermodynamic gap in the system. But here, what we're doing is we're doing a spectroscopy, right? So we just tune the gate to some voltage and sweep, sample tip bias. And at some gate voltage, we see a gap, and at some voltages, we don't see this gap. Okay, and then we just plot what gate voltage that gap is as a function of field. And that amounts to basically doing the same thing. But the power of the STM in this case is that it tells you whether the gap is a single particle gap or a correlation effect. Because you can have this gap, and as you tune the density, the gap can go below the chemical potential, if you know what I mean. It doesn't have to be always tied to the chemical potential if it's some single particle effect. It can be like a gap that you tune your density, you arrive at it. But because it always forms at the chemical potential, we know that this is coming from interaction effects. And what's cool about it is the way it moves with density and field is what follows these plots. So it's much bigger gap than you would get from any Zeeman effect. And it's because it's coming from the exchange interaction of the electrons, and the exchange interaction between the electrons suddenly lower their energy and they make these insulating phases, which are not ordinary insulators because their gap actually depends on field and density. That's kind of the simplest way to describe it.
Okay. Ali, it seems like you have some lines that you draw thick there in this plot, right, where you see something, and then you have some that you draw thin where you don't seem to see something. So you must have some explanation.
So the blue lines, the thick lines are the ones that correspond to -1, -2, and -3. And I think that I don't know actually what the light lines are. The light lines may be having to do with there are other gaps you can get from Landau fans that can complicate our interpretation. So the lines that you see in the middle, so there is a 0th Landau level in this system. And this zero lambda level actually has 8-fold degeneracy. And if you fill out each of this degeneracy by tuning the gate voltage, you actually make like integer quantum Hall effect states, which will have a Chern number of 1. So each of these 1, 2, 3, 4 are corresponding to like Chern number 1, 2, 3, 4. And each of these are like gaps that are centered on each of those. And the usefulness of this center part of this plot is we kind of calibrating the technique with something that we understand. It's actually just integer quantum Hall effect. And the integer quantum Hall effect is a little bit more complicated because each of the integers have multiple flavors. And if you fill each flavor, it changes the Chern number by 1. And that's what the symbols are kind of centered on that. The error bars are like being very cautious about what the error bars are, you know, covering the whole span of, you know, a charging die. You know, nearby these insulators, you get a lot of charging, which is what gives rise to the error bars in here. And the thing to focus on is the thick lines. The thin lines are other possible, you know, lambda quantization that you can get having to do with these integer values, which could be some of the gaps we see, but it looks like most of the lines fall across what we see of these sequences of Chern numbers, which were actually unanticipated before the experiment. But theoretically, it looks like now people are doing calculations, and there are a number of different ways of looking at these type of experiments in terms of, you know, what are the many body states that can create these numbers of the Chern numbers that we measure experimentally. And there are basically several calculations which reproduces the sequences that we see, having to do with the fact that these calculations expect that the system makes sort of valley coherent states that are what we call orbital magnets. And these orbital magnets basically are Chern insulators, which gives rise to a gap. And they will have this sequence of 1, 2, 3. The sequence that we observe comes from these sequence of Chern numbers associated with these basically valley polarized, valley coherent states that are sort of in several different models, this can come out. Now, I would say it's not completely conclusive that what we see is what actually these states. There's more predictions about how to confirm whether these states are actually the ones that we see beyond the gaps and the Chern numbers that we see experimentally. And that hopefully I can get to towards the end about how we would go about that. So let's see, how much time do I have?
Well, I mean, maybe 15 minutes max.
Perfect. So let me spend the next 15 minutes telling you a bit about superconductivity. So it's still a mystery why this material superconducts. So I showed you that there is a lot of electron-electron interaction, but remember, this is a system with very large density of states coming from this Van Host singularity. So it's not unreasonable to think that, you know, maybe it would be a BCS superconductor mediated by phonons. And there are a lot of questions about what the nature of superconductivity is, whether it's a conventional S-wave superconductor or whether it's an unconventional superconductor. So let me, in the next few minutes, let me show you that how we find evidence for this system being unconventional. So this is what I showed you before, but now we're going to cool the sample down to millikelvins. The place where you get the strongest superconductivity in the system is between nu equals -2 and -3. So what you have, this is a big plot on the left-hand side. The plot in the middle shows you a zoom in of the data near nu equals -2 and nu equals -3. So let me zoom into this. These are two different samples, just to show you how the data looks in two different samples. What you see here is, if you focus in the color plots in the middle, the one on the right is very clear. You kind of see a gap that opens up around nu equals -2. It becomes a dark blue, and then all of a sudden it becomes it becomes, yeah, somebody's drawing on the screen, which is very useful if I knew how to do that.
Let me see if I can clear that.
Yeah, somehow my mouse just decided not to work when it's in.
It's very interesting.
No
I've never seen that. I don't think I can clear that.
Okay, well, it's at least light yellow. So you see the conductance at zero bias, it sort of dips down in both figures, more prominently the figure on the far right. It dips down, indicating a gap that's sort of developing. Then this gap closes and another gap opens. And that persists between sort of the green region between -2 and -3. You have this large region where the sample is gapped. So here's the problem with this type of measurement. The problem is that, of course, both an insulator and a superconductor would look gapped to STM spectra, right? How could you tell the difference between the two? So this is where we had an idea of how to use the STM in a slightly different mode, which is that, of course, you can do tunneling spectroscopy with the STM, but you can also bring the STM tip and actually gently touch the sample and form an Andreev reflection between a point contact between the tip and the sample. So what this does is that basically you have a normal electrode on the tip side. The tip is a normal metal, and maybe you have a superconductor in the sample side. So as you tune the basically the tip sample bias, what will happen is that if you go below the gap of the superconductor, you basically have a supercurrent in the superconductor. So what should happen in the conductance of the Andreev junction is you get an enhancement of the conductivity. So for an S-wave superconductor, this will look like a flat top, like a top hat shape, the blue curve. Other superconductors which have nodes, D-wave and P-wave superconductor, the shape would look different. And the main thing is that you have this enhanced conductivity at low bias, which ideally should be about twice that of the conductivity outside where the gap is. And this is basically what we were able to do. So what we were able to do was to perform this experiment when the tip sample bias was low, and where the gate voltage was tuned to the regime where we expect superconductivity to appear. We actually observed this enhanced conductivity coming from the Andreev reflection process. So what's happening is an electron goes in, and on the other side you have Cooper pairs. So Cooper pairs go forward, and what has to happen is a hole has to reflect back into the conductor in order to for the pairs to go forward. And this is sort of the Andreev reflection process. And what you see nicely here in the signal is that it actually, as you warm up the sample to about 1 Kelvin, is where transported studies show around 1.5 Kelvin in many samples of magic angle graphene at, around 1 degree. TC is around 1 Kelvin. Right around that TC, this signal goes away. Okay. And I'll show you later that as a function of magnetic field, it also suppresses. So what's nice about this experiment is we could do the spectroscopy, which is what's shown here in one of the panels on the right-hand side, labeled STS. You can see the spectroscopy shows a lot of different features, a lot of different gaps near the chemical potential. And what you see here on the panel on the most right-hand side is the Andreev reflection experiment performed on the same location. And what's nice about this is that, where you have the dark purple in the Andreev reflection, for example, near -4 or near close to 0 or near negative, +2 and so on, that's actually, or -2, that's actually where those gaps, we expect the system to be an insulator. So the point contact actually shows a high resistivity, which is what you want. And just between -1 below the insulator region, between -2 and -3, is where you have that enhanced conductivity, but the enhanced conductivity is limited to very low bias region. So you really know now that this is the superconducting sample that's underneath our tip. And not all samples that you make become superconducting, and this is something that the success rate depends on how clean the sample is and the details of the angle. As you go away from an angle by more than 0.2 degrees, all the physics that I showed you about disappears. So what's cool about this is that then we could really say, oh, here's the sample. It's really superconducting. It has a gap in the tunneling spectra, but it also shows an Andreev signal. And this Andreev signal is just where we expect superconductivity to be, and it disappears at around 1 Kelvin. So then we can go ask, what does the shape of the tunneling spectra look like in the superconducting state? And here are two different samples, two different devices. It's and on the bottom left-hand side, you can see with this machine doing spectroscopy of aluminum, and we extract some electron temperature from our spectroscopy in this machine, which is around 200 or 250 millikelvin. And essentially what we see in a sample that has TC of about the same, remember the TC of this magic angle graphene is about 1 Kelvin. We clearly see this V-shaped curve. And this V-shaped curve is something that's very consistently observed across all the samples. So if you look at that, there are two things that jumps out at you. First is the V-shaped curve, which is not like aluminum. It's not an S-wave superconductor with a flat bottom. Second also is the size of the gap. The size of the gap over TC, remember in BCS superconductor is around 3.5 Kelvin. Here you have the size of the gap over TC, which is like 25. Okay, so this is another one of those things we often observe in strongly correlated superconductors is the size of the tunneling gap that we observe from superconductivity in the superconducting samples, which are strongly correlated, is always very large compared to the BCS ratio. And you can play around with fitting this curve, and we have done that. And essentially, you cannot really fit it with an S-wave superconductor, even if you broaden it extremely, because the broadening has to be larger than 2 Kelvin, which is just kind of unphysical when you're doing experiments at a few hundred millikelvin. If you just say, okay, I'm going to fit it to a nodal superconductor, it doesn't really matter if it's an S-wave or a D-wave. If you're just averaging over the Fermi surface, there are directions where there are no gaps, and that they will show up exactly the same way. In this type of measurement, the broadening parameters are more reasonable and relatively small. So that's one of the interesting things. So since my time is running out, let me just tell you a couple of items that makes us convinced that this is a very unconventional superconductor. First is this large ratio of 2 delta over KTC. This gap actually survives above the TC of the sample. Just focus on the panel on the right-hand side. This is done at 4 Kelvin, 4 times the TC. We still see a gap well above the TC of the sample in the gate range where superconductivity appears at low temperatures. So it has a pseudo gap behavior, which is another behavior that's very common with unconventional superconductors. What's really cool is we can actually make a very precise measurement of the pseudo gap because it takes very little magnetic field to kill superconductivity in this material. Our transport colleagues basically know that by about 100 millitesla, essentially the resistance is no longer zero. The sample is resistive. We can confirm that using our Andreev reflection experiment. The Andreev reflection goes away by 100 millitesla. But if you do tunneling spectroscopy, you still see a very sharp gap, up to like 0.5 or 1 Tesla. So the phenomena is very interesting because it's a system which develops this pseudo gap, even though the sample is not globally superconducting. And this is now another one of the key questions we're trying to understand what it means. This reminds us of a lot of things we see in high TC Cooper rates, where we see a pseudo gap, even the sample is not fully not superconducting. Lastly, let me just say, I already told you that the Andreev reflection signal disappears at TC. Which is what this red line is. There are two different ways of making measurement of the Andreev signal, whether you can measure the extracted gap, or you can just plot the excess current having to do with having this excess conductivity. But the other thing that's kind of reminiscent of high temperature superconductors is that the energy scale associated with the Andreev reflection and the energy scale associated with the tunneling spectroscopy are also different. The Andreev reflection has a smaller energy scale. It disappears at TC. The tunneling spectra has a much larger energy scale, and it doesn't disappear at TC. So this is all very reminiscent of things we have seen in high TC cuprate. So since I'm running out of time, let me just show you one last experiment, which is very interesting. So I told you we have always a boron nitride sample underneath this. And depending on whether you align the boron nitride or not, different phenomena have been observed. So we managed to make a sample that was aligned with boron nitride. And we were able to actually see that at filling of 3, this material makes a churn insulator, very consistent with David Horvath Gordon and Andre Young. This is a gap that you see up here. But what's really interesting is superconductivity completely disappears. If you align the sample with boron nitride, it just completely kills superconductivity in the material. It even kills the pseudo gap, and all the physics that I told you about becomes different. So let me just summarize what I told you and just give it a sort of outlook a little bit and stop. So what I told you is this is a material that's very strongly correlated. We can see its effect in spectroscopy in many different ways. I told you about these churn insulating phases that we see when we turn on a little bit of magnetic field. It's stabilized. We can see these churn insulators due to these correlations. I told you about the fact that there is a pseudo gap phase above when the sample is superconducting or in field and temperature. And when we go into the superconducting phase that everybody has reproduced in many different transport studies, we see this V-shaped gap that really has many of the characteristics of other unconventional superconductors. So studying the superconductivity of this system is very promising because it has all the characteristics of many correlated superconductors, but it is a chemically very clean system. So there's a lot of different experiments which is still waiting to be done on this material. So as a way of sort of looking ahead, let me just say that this talk was just about one of the family of these sort of moire materials. So this is just based on graphene. And this field is enormous. And there are many, many different type of 2D materials, Van der Waals material. There are many interesting physics associated with stacking different materials on top of one another, whether it's going to multiple layers that now have shown superconductivity as well, or whether introducing physics from one layer into the other, whether it's a magnet introducing magnetic or spin orbit coupling, introducing spin orbit coupling from one layer to the other. The knobs in this Lego box of 2D materials is very large. Not all of them are as easy to study as graphene. Graphene was already pretty complicated in order to get clean devices. But maybe we'll come up with ways in which we can prepare these materials in a way that is very clean from the surface perspective, from STM studies, which would be a huge challenge. But already transport experiments tell us that the amount of sort of possible phenomena that we can observe is very large in this class of materials. So with that, let me stop and see if there are any questions.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Ali, for this fantastic talk. Amazing. I mean, just incredible what you and I guess other colleagues have figured out in this twisted bilayer graphene. So talk is open for questions. You can either type your questions in the chat, I'll read them, or feel free to just take the mic and ask your questions.
Thank you, Ali, for the very nice talk. I have a question regarding the chain insulator part. So is there any possibility to see the edge state associated with those chain insulators?
That's a great question. It's the edges of the samples are quite disordered. I think that we have some ideas of how to make split gate devices, if you know what I mean. If you can have two gates that are sort of straddling and the sample drapes both two gates so that you can create the edge in the middle of the sample. I think it is possible. I think there's been some effort. I think Joe is here, but Joe in graphene looking at edge states there using using the AFM technique at millikelvin and so on. But I think the edges of our samples are usually very, very disordered. So we will probably try to do some sort of a split gate device. That's what one of the things we're working on. I think it's possible.
Hi, Ollie. This is Joe. I had a question.
Hi, Joe.
On the Andreev reflection, if you then do that measurement as a function of tip sample distance, do you see it smoothly going from Andreev reflection to the gap?
Yeah, so we did some experiments. It's in the supplement of the paper. Yeah, you do see it smoothly go. I would say you start to see two features in the data. So there is the bigger gap that's sort of there, and then slowly you see some feature that's a lower bias, and that's the sort of the second feature. And we got this question, which was sort of a fair question from the referee, that, well, maybe, you know, when you're touching the sample, the property is different than when you're not touching the sample because you're straining the sample. But we see the Andreev signal kind of stay around the same bias, the turn-on bias of the Andreev signal. It's not a very clean experiment, but we have some data set that look better than the other, where you can see two features simultaneously, the tunneling and the Andreev signal. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Ali, in the superconductivity part, I was confused. Why is there a special dome between filling factor -2 and -3? I mean, you sort of showed us that they are all the same, right? In the beginning, you convinced me that this whole thing is just repeating and repeating. But what's so special about -2 and -3?
Sorry, yeah. So the strongest superconductivity is observed between -2 and -3. So the superconductivity, so that's a great question. I should have put it in introduction. So initial discovery was between -2 and -3. Then people observe also, I think also in the initial work, between +2 and +3, there was also superconductivity. And then there was one paper which saw superconductivity around every integer filling, but that has never been reproduced. But the thing that keeps reproducing is the superconductivity between -2 and -3. And if you look at our data, so let me bring our data. So we have now many samples. We have seen superconductivity. Let me see. We have seen superconductivity consistently between -2 and -3, and sometimes, I don't have the data here, sometimes between 2 and 3, but not always. We don't know. I would say that's actually one of the reasons, one of the questions why. So we think the -2 state is very special. It is a sort of insulator that is required for superconductivity to form doping next to it. And maybe
so there's no, I mean, meaning there's no good understanding of why this particular part is special?
So there are some theoretical proposals. So remember, so there are the spin and valley degrees of freedom. So as you start to fill in the electrons, so at 2, you have, you know, 2 flavors filled. So you can be spin polarized, you can be spin unpolarized, valley coherent, valley superposition. So you can make different combination of states, right? And some people believe that certain combination of those states are very natural for superconductivity to form. And there is now a race to figure out sort of what is the state, you know, that we are forming. And the challenge in this field is that the samples are very hard to make, such that they reproduce all the phenomena, and then you can study them to get at the answer. But there are reasons to believe that some of these, so for example, at charge neutrality, you will have, you know, 4 flavors filled. And so that's going to be very different than 2 flavors filled. So the combination of which quantum state you're more likely to form is going to be dependent on how many flavors you got filling.
Okay, cool. Other questions?
I think I have another question. So if I imagine this AA sites as quantum dots, And let's say if I feel like odd numbers of electrons inside, is it possible to do spin resonance of that?
That's a great question. I think it is. I think it's not a crazy question at all, because so remember, it's a quantum dot with just unpaired electron, and it may be very low density electrons, so it may not be, you know, as bad as, like, you know, the spin resonance might not get so badly you know, it's not like tunneling into a metal, if you know what I mean. So it could be that it has some of, as Andreas know, we're trying to, you know, copy the technique and try to bring in some of these techniques to maybe some of these materials to study. Yeah, I think it is an interesting question. It's one we've been thinking about. So we have unpaired spins, and the hopping is low.
Right, right.
And maybe it will give a spin resonance signal.
Yes.
It was a very powerful technique to do locally on figure out what's going on in this material.
Right. Maybe especially in the case of when you align to BN, then you can see how the magnetism is developed, maybe.
Yeah, all of the above. I guess it's just sort of unknown at this point, right?
Right.
It's one of those things you got to try.
Wonderful.
Good question. I mean, if you believe our understanding of it, basically, especially at high temperatures, before this system make a spin polarized state, you have these tumbling spins in the middle of this problem everywhere. In fact, there is some very interesting physics happens that the spins, as you cool, you know, there is this effect that at nu equals 1, you have 1 electron per Moiré site. Okay, just 1. And what is seen in transport studies is that when you warm up the system, it likes to maybe make a spin polarized state. And when you cool it down, it doesn't like to be spin polarized. It has this Pomeranchuk effect, which it likes to, the spin entropy, it actually disorders the spin system. So there's some really interesting spin properties that people have figured out by looking at, for example, compressibility and transport studies of this system. So nu equals 1 is just 1 electron per Moiré site. It's just 1 unpaired electron.
Interesting. So the lower the temperature, the more like disorder it is.
Yeah, because the entropy part.
Liquid.
Yeah, it's a Pomeranchuk effect that happens also in helium. It's a very interesting effect. It's because of the spin entropy overwhelms the ordering of the spin system.
I see.
But most of the magnetism in this system is orbital, associated with the valley coherent, is making valley coherent states, which may have circulating currents, for example, which is also quite exotic.
Very cool.
Which is not, you know, they're not really been measured. So local probes could be a very powerful way of figuring out what states you have. It's very early days, you know, as you notice, I showed you very little conductance maps, almost none. So, you know, there's a lot to figure out in this problem. It's quite a lot. It's a very rich problem.
Good. So I have my typical question that I'll always ask, basically, what's the most difficult part of this experiment?
Making the samples. And making the samples survive, because they'll blow up.
And making
they're very delicate samples, and making the samples clean. In fact, you know, we kind of really jumped into doing all of this ourselves, because we collaborating with other people. The feedback was just not fast enough, and other people didn't really worry about cleanliness at the level that we need to worry about doing STL, as you well know. Yeah, then once the sample is good and is clean, and you know, it works very well.
And kind of related to this, I mean, in all of your samples, it seems like the gate voltage of 0 really corresponds to 0, which I remember. I mean, I only done this very, very, very long time ago before the boron nitride, and that was never the case. The 0 was always in some crazy gate voltage, right? So this is now much better, I guess. Just better quality of samples.
It's quality of sample. So it's not strictly zero. It can be like a little bit off, like a. So we also have, so here, you know, like sometimes it can be a 1 or 2 volts off, for example, from really zero. But yeah, in general, like this one, maybe the charge neutrality is maybe a little bit above, you know, maybe a few volts away for this particular sample. But that relates to how much contamination you have on your sample. When you remove the contamination, and there is also tip gating effect, which is we often, in the early days, we found that the tip was gating the sample. In magic angle graphene is less of a problem because the flat bands have a large density of states, so it's okay if you do a little bit of gating with the tip. But we also find that preparing the tip on copper and making the tip very, very sharp reduces any kind of tip gating effect, which early days was very much a problem for us.
So to make the tips here, I guess you have to have a second sample nearby to be able to do field emission and cleaning and crashing and whatnot, right?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's a standard in our lab now. All the microscope have 2 samples, and for these experiments is I feel like it's very required, because otherwise it's just the experiment's too painful.
Yes.
The tip goes bad, you know, quite often. Quite often.
Cool. All right. Any other questions?
Okay.
If not, let's. Oh, go ahead.
I have one question about the locality of your superconductivity. You said that the A site is really highly correlated, but AB site is not related to that. So even the superconductivity, you can measure on the AA site, or it's some overall.
No. Yeah, so superconductivity happens everywhere, and so it's just when you're in the AA or AB sites, you're very sensitive to the flat bands. On the AB side, the flat band density of state is suppressed, so then you can pick up the other bands a little bit easier. So if you recall, so here is like when you're in the AA side, you see a lot of these features. You know, you see these very sharp features having to do with the flat bands. When you go to the AB side, you still see them, but then these other features, which are the other bands, become easier to measure. It's just a relative intensity of what we call remote bands versus the flat bands. So the intensity of these bands that are away from the chemical potential here, that are shown here, what we call the remote bands, their intensity is much larger on the AB side than it is on the AA sides. And that's expected theoretically.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Okay, Ali, thank you very much for taking the time tonight. And thank you. And we have 2 more colloquiums coming up later this year. So for those of you who are on our mailing list, you know, we're looking forward to the next talks. Hopefully there will be in person, but we will do a good job streaming them also, so that if you want to participate remotely, you're welcome to do so. All right. So with that, thank you very much, Ali. Have a good night.
Thank you.
And see you some other time.
Yeah, have a great day. Bye.
Bye, Ali.